What makes dialogue like this so bad?
Wait a second, okay? Just give me a second.
We're not gonna be one of those assholes on the news who watches a crime happen and not do something. We're not assholes.
Just a second.
And dialogue like this so amazing.
You know what date is on this coin?
No.
1958. It's been traveling 22 years to get here. And now it's here. And it's either heads or tails. And you have to say, call it.
Writing dialogue can be tricky, and writers often have the wrong idea about the purpose dialogue should really serve. Dialogue should be a window into a character's soul, revealing who they are and what they want. In other words, we should learn about a character through what they choose to say, rather than choosing words for them that are only meant to reveal the details of the plot. How do you do this? Or how do you avoid writing bad dialogue at the very least? Well, there are many ways, but today I'll be focusing on 4 key principles: expositional dialogue, subtext, repetition, and flow. By applying these principles, you should find yourself on a great starting track toward writing dialogue more like this.
I see the worst in people, Henry. I don't need to look past seeing them to get all I need.
And less like this.
Get lost. You wouldn't recognize a goddamn vampire if one jumped up and bit you on the end of your f***ing dick. So just get off my back.
Alright, that was actually kind of amazing, but you get the point. Part 1. Expositional dialogue, or avoiding as you know. Of all the principles we'll be going over today, I think this one is the most difficult to avoid. In fact, it's probably accurate to say that it's impossible to eliminate altogether, but it should still be reduced as much as possible. As you know refers to dialogue that is written solely for the benefit of the viewer, who doesn't know all of the context of the story, while the characters themselves do. For some examples of this, let's take a look at the pilot episode of Game of Thrones. In this scene, we're introduced to 2 of our principal characters for the series, Cersei and Jaime Lannister. The first words out of Jaime's mouth are,
"As your brother, I feel it's my duty to warn you. You worry too much."
For those who have seen the first season or read the first novel, you'll understand why knowing that these characters are siblings is absolutely key context to the plot. However, considering they've lived their entire lives together, they would obviously know that. But this particular example is done in a fairly natural way. He's sort of teasing her here, and saying, "as your brother," works within that context. I actually think of this more like an idiom or turn of phrase, and have heard it quite commonly. However, just seconds later, we get this.
"When we were 7, you jumped off the cliffs at Castle Rock. 100-foot drop into the water. You were never afraid."
And then this.
But who would you tell?
My husband.
If you told the king, both our heads would be skewered in the city gates by now.
Cersei recites a story they both already know just for the sake of telling us that Jaime is reckless, but also fearless and assertive. Then she makes a point to refer to her husband, who Jaime makes a point to refer to as the king. It would probably be more natural if she referred to him simply as Robert, rather than my husband, but this is done for our benefit. This leads to dialogue that isn't necessarily believable. They're only saying this because we need to know this context to understand the payoff at the end of the season. A lot of the context in this example didn't need to be delivered in such an on-the-nose fashion. For example, we see very clearly later that Cersei is married to Robert through the fact that they travel together to Winterfell, that she's dressed like a queen. I mean, Ned even refers to her as my queen.
My queen.
As often as possible, you should rely on the visuals to help establish context rather than using as you know dialogue, especially as egregiously as this.
"That's Jaime Lannister, the Queen's twin brother."
Would you please shut up?
Part 2. Subtext, or reading between the lines. This to me is so important in writing nuanced and thoughtful dialogue. Subtext, also known as undertone, is content which is not announced explicitly by the characters or the author, but is rather implicit and becomes understood by the audience as the work unfolds. There's lots of reasons why we don't say exactly what's on our minds all the time. Human psychology is incredibly complicated, but some of the most common reasons are because we're embarrassed or afraid, or because it might be inappropriate for a specific social setting, or because we don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. I could go on. I mean, flirting is all about subtext. It's like a game or a dance where two people sort of put their wit and confidence on display. What you're really thinking is, "You're really hot and I want to sleep with you." But you would never say something so direct because that defeats the purpose and fun of flirting, which is why this dialogue here is so grossly out of place and awkward.
I'm exhausted.
Yeah, me too, but I'm really wired. What do you say I take you home and eat your pussy?
In this scene from Ordinary People, Conrad is dealing with survivor's guilt after an attempted suicide. His father wants to connect with him, while his mother is more concerned about constructing the kind of perfect family life she thinks she should have. Along that line of thinking, what demonstrates the cliché of a happy family life more than sitting down and having breakfast together? When Conrad refuses her French toast, expressing that he isn't hungry, we immediately see how this offends her, and she throws the food down the disposal. What she says here is,
Can't say French toast.
I'm sure we've all seen this kind of passive aggressiveness in our own families. She's insisting that she's doing this because you can't save French toast for later, but obviously the subtext here is that she's frustrated with her son for destroying the sense of normalcy she wants in her life. She cares more about that than she does about his mental health or well-being. This is the kind of subtext we use constantly in everyday conversations, and telling your audience about your characters through subtext, revealing their true thoughts and feelings in an implicit way, will not only feel more intuitive and credible to the ear, but will make your dialogue so much more layered and interesting. Part 3. Repetition, or the Law of Diminishing Returns. In psychology, the law of diminishing returns states that the more a person repeats something, the less value, enjoyment, or impact that person will receive from that activity. The same is true with language and dialogue. The more you repeat a certain sentiment, the less impact it has. Of course, this doesn't mean that you can't ever repeat something and find enjoyment in it, and repetition is obviously necessary in the learning process to get something to stick in your brain. It's just that in a lot of cases, slowly over time, the more you repeat something, the less surprise and enjoyment you'll typically find in it.
Oh man! Oh God! Oh man! Oh God! Oh man! Oh God! Oh man! Oh God! Oh man! Oh God!
This is why you'll often see people who say things like, "I wish I could watch this again for the first time," because you can't ever experience the shock of a brilliant plot twist on a second viewing.
I am your father.
With dialogue, when you repeat certain sentiments over and over again, not only will it affect the audience less and less each time, but soon will start to have the opposite effect, either making them laugh or, even worse, irritating them. A lot of modern JRPGs tend to have a problem with this, and it can lead to a ton of padding, filler text, as well as pacing issues. Part 4. Flow, or mimicking the believability of real conversation. Language is sloppy, and communication can be really difficult. I mean, think about it. We experience life through the prism of an individual mind. We can only understand our own thoughts, feelings, and observations. For everything else, we rely on language to understand the thoughts of other people, and we make lots of mistakes. We stutter, we ramble, we talk in circles. We're not very efficient. They're going back and sort of like exploring some of Geralt's, previous adventures. Robert McKee talks about this a little bit by recounting how he asks his students to record one of their real-life conversations and then transcribe it word for word. As I did this myself, what really surprised me was both how often people interrupt each other and also how they completely derail with non sequiturs. Like, it's crazy how something will come into someone's head and they just completely veer off course. However, despite how clumsy this might be, it is still the reality of how we communicate, and capturing that while still keeping the story moving at a good pace and foreshadowing conflicts will go a long way toward making your dialogue feel believable. I recently rewatched Burn After Reading, and it was amazing how the Coen brothers captured these kinds of mistakes in conversations while still keeping the dialogue purposeful in how it reveals important traits of the characters and keeps the plot moving. Let's sample some of it. Notice how characters use filler words like and like.
What? Well, this analyst Cox was attacking the gym guy. It was in broad daylight on the street. Our man did not know what to do, felt he had to step in.
Also note how they interrupt each other, veer off course, and talk about things that seem irrelevant.
I was just telling your husband that I have a condition where I'm going to anaphylactic shock when I...
Harry works in the Marshal Service, Doug.
Oh, I'm on the legislative side. I work with Senator Hobby.
The truth is that none of this is irrelevant. Take George Clooney's character here when he talks about how in his 20 years of Marshal Service he's never discharged his weapon.
Gun's no big deal. 20 years of Marshal Service, I never discharged my weapon.
From his mannerisms, we can see that he's constantly nervous, unfocused, and wired, but tells this story to convince others that he's cool under pressure, sure of himself, and has a solid idea of what he wants in life. Of course, that couldn't be further from the truth, and without spoiling the end of the movie, it's important to understand that while he desperately wants to see himself as this cool and collected marshal, he's really a freaking mess. Tarantino is also great with this kind of non sequitur dialogue, which might feel pointless in the moment, but is actually being used to set something up for later. If you want to understand how to inject some of this realistic, messy dialogue into your script without totally losing your audience, I would definitely suggest studying Tarantino and the Coens. They're some of the best in the business with this. There's definitely a lot more that goes into writing excellent dialogue, but to avoid piling on and making this into an hour-long video, I think I'll go ahead and stop there. If you can master these 4 principles, then you'll vastly improve your writing, selling the believability of your characters and the plights they face. Just remember, avoid having your characters say things they already know, don't have them blankly state exactly what's on their minds, don't repeat sentiments or phrases over and over again, and add some personality by mimicking the flow of real conversation. Just make sure you're still foreshadowing conflict and revealing important traits of your characters. Don't actually derail your conversations with random filler text. If you can handle that, you'll be well on your way to writing effective dialogue. I'd like to thank our patrons who make it possible for me to put this kind of time and effort into these videos. If you appreciate the work that we're doing on the channel, consider heading to our Patreon page by clicking on the icon here on the screen. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again real soon.